Throughout the 1930s, the world watched as Germany rebuilt itself from a shattered, defeated state into a formidable military machine. One that would soon wage war against the same nations that, barely a decade before, had crushed its pride and stripped it of dignity. In the wake of World War I, a single man orchestrated this remarkable turnaround: Adolf Hitler. He stood apart from most Germans of his era in one striking way. He genuinely welcomed the prospect of war rather than dreading it. What made Hitler magnetic wasn't merely his talent for stirring up enormous crowds. It ran deeper than that, functioning almost like a narcotic, both mesmerizing and lethal at once. So how exactly did he rise to become Germany's most formidable figure? Who were the Nazis, really? And how did they manage to inject new life into a nation left in ruins? A peculiar, restless energy coursed through the streets of Weimar Germany. The Nazis fed on an insatiable need for public affirmation, ceaseless cheers, unwavering devotion from the masses. Terror became just as essential to their grip on power. Any hint of opposition was crushed outright, even when doing so meant betraying the so-called national revolution they claimed to champion. Countless Germans found themselves seduced by one man's magnetism, a doomed infatuation that would go on to shape the darkest era in the country's history. At this stage, Hitler didn't yet view himself as a savior figure. He saw himself more as a forerunner, a John the Baptist, paving the way rather than the Messiah himself. It was only during his time behind bars at Landsberg that the truth crystallized for him. My God, I am the chosen one. To truly grasp this ill-fated love affair between Germany and Hitler, we have to go back to the closing decades of the 19th century. By then, Germany had emerged as Europe's most dominant, prosperous, and technologically cutting-edge nation. It leaned authoritarian in many ways, sure, but it also maintained a national parliament with genuine elections, even though its authority remained constrained, if gradually expanding. This was a fiercely militarized empire governed by the hereditary Hohenzollern dynasty. Britain had initially supported German unification following the Franco-Prussian War, but soon began eyeing the emerging power with suspicion, fearing that Germany's thriving industry and growing military strength might overshadow its own waning empire. And indeed, following that conflict, Germany's economy took off, surpassing Britain in industrial output and falling behind only the United States by the time the First World War erupted. There remained so much left to accomplish: building a nation, forging unity, shaping a collective vision for the future. Germany's ambition was to stand shoulder to shoulder with the other great imperial powers. And that ambition came laced with both envy and admiration for the British Empire. The envy made sense. Britain controlled roughly a quarter of the world's land and a quarter of its population. But Germany also carried a fierce sense of its own superiority. Many historians describe it as a dangerously expansionist power, one whose ambitions threatened to blow apart the existing balance of power in Europe. Tensions were simmering everywhere, and Germany, arriving late to the colonial game, was determined to become an imperial power in its own right. But our story doesn't actually begin in Germany. It begins next door, in Austria-Hungary. We don't know a great deal about Hitler's earliest years. He was born in Braunau am Inn on April 20, 1889, the son of a low-ranking Austrian civil servant. His father wasn't a kind man and was physically rough with him, which pushed his mother into a fiercely protective role. Hitler's childhood was, by most accounts, unhappy. He had 4 siblings who died before he was even born. Beyond that, though, his upbringing seems to have been fairly ordinary, not wildly different from that of his peers. The trouble for historians is that Hitler later reinvented large chunks of his own childhood story. As a student, he was mediocre, not because he lacked intelligence, because he clearly had plenty, but because he couldn't focus. He remained scattered like that for much of his life, though he never stopped reading voraciously, devouring anything he could get his hands on. Out of that habit came a kind of self-taught education, a strange patchwork stitched together from all sorts of sources, but never anything coherent, simply because he'd never learned how to sit still and pay attention. In 1907, a young Adolf Hitler traveled to Vienna hoping to build a career as an artist. At the time, Vienna was the epicenter of new artistic movements and philosophical ideas in Europe, and Hitler set his sights on the Academy of Fine Arts. He arrived around age 16, and mostly just drifted. He never lived in the kind of poverty he later claimed. He was rejected from art school, and honestly, looking at his surviving work, it's hard to argue the decision was wrong. That said, he understood art in a broader sense. He knew neoclassical styles, and he grasped the emotional power that great historical imagery could wield. So even though his watercolors never went anywhere, he clearly understood what art could do to people. Throughout his life, Hitler liked to claim he was an artist torn away from his easel by his love for Germany. His mother, generous to a fault, kept sending him money, possibly without his father even knowing. Some biographers describe him during this period as something of a layabout, drifting through Vienna's cafe culture and mixing with a deeply flawed circle of cafe intellectuals who fed him many of the ideas he'd later call, in Mein Kampf, the granite foundation of my thinking. It's often assumed that Austrian anti-Semitism, which was widespread before 1914, heavily shaped him during this period. But that's actually difficult to prove. Nearly all of his personal encounters with Jewish people in these years were not just neutral, but genuinely positive. The doctor who treated his sick mother, the family physician who cared for all of them, was Jewish. So was the art dealer who bought and sold his paintings in Vienna, helping keep him afloat financially. After receiving his inheritance from his father's estate and finding little success as an artist, Hitler decided to relocate to Munich in 1913. He felt strongly German by ethnicity and identity, and as a German nationalist, he believed he belonged in Germany far more than in Austria. Austria-Hungary was still technically a great power, dominating much of southeastern Europe, but it was cracking under the weight of rising nationalism, Czech, Hungarian, South Slav movements all clashing inside its parliamentary bodies, turning the Reichsrat and its Hungarian counterpart into near ungovernable shouting matches. That experience seems to have left Hitler with a deep contempt for parliamentary democracy. He saw it as hopelessly ineffective. Looking at this sprawling, creaking empire, he became convinced that only strong authoritarian leadership, even outright dictatorship, could actually solve anything. It was the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo that lit the fuse for World War I. Within weeks, Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia. Germany mobilized, invaded Luxembourg and Belgium, and pushed toward France, prompting Britain to declare war on Germany in response. Hitler, though technically an Austrian citizen living in Munich, managed to enlist in the German army amid the chaos of mobilization in August 1914. His paperwork was essentially overlooked in the confusion. Austrian authorities were actually searching for him, since he'd dodged conscription back home and was living abroad in Germany instead. He simply didn't want to fight for a cause, or an empire he didn't believe in. He had no faith in the Habsburgs. As war spread across the continent, Germany found itself fighting on two fronts, the Russians to the east and Britain-France, and Belgium to the west. Hitler had joined up to defend the German Empire, and the war would go on to reshape not just his life, but the lives of millions of others before being shipped to the Western Front, where Germany was locked in combat against Britain and its allies. Hitler's actual role was a modest one, a corporal in the German army, but he was captivated by the whole idea of war. In a real sense, the First World War is what turned him from a nobody into a somebody. By most accounts, he was a solid, disciplined soldier, eventually promoted to ensign rank, and he survived the entire war from start to finish. No small feat given how many didn't. He served as a battalion runner, which kept him close to the front line, though not quite as embedded in front-line combat as he later claimed. Still, he was genuinely in danger, well within range of British and French artillery, and runners had to physically carry messages up through the communication trenches. In 1918, he was seriously gassed. People have tried to downplay his wartime record, but he actually earned the Iron Cross Second Class and later the Iron Cross First Class, the latter recommended, ironically, by a Jewish superior officer. The notion that he was some kind of coward simply doesn't hold up. He showed real courage. That said, messengers were often viewed by frontline infantry as having a relatively easy time of it. What remains a genuine puzzle is why he was never made an officer, possibly apocryphal, but it's been suggested he lacked the leadership qualities for it. Hitler doesn't seem to have been particularly well liked or respected by his fellow soldiers, something of a loner, a bit odd. Yet he looked back on the war as a time of unity, camaraderie, and brotherhood, mythologizing it in his own mind to the point where, once in power in 1933, he actively tried to recreate the spirit of 1914, when all Germans had rallied behind the Kaiser. Meanwhile, on the Eastern Front, Russia mobilized and clashed with Austria-Hungary, but was ultimately halted by German forces in Prussia. With Germany clearly the stronger military power, it forced the Bolsheviks to sign the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, handing the Baltic states to Germany and granting recognized independence to Ukraine. By early 1918, having secured this treaty with Russia, Germany had effectively acquired its own Eastern Empire, and the long-dreaded two-front war had finally ended. That was widely read as a sign Germany was winning. But everything now hinged on the Western Front, and with America now in the war, German victory there was no longer realistic. The threat of American involvement had grown into stark reality as German U-boats sank ships, including those carrying American citizens, in a ruthless, unrestricted submarine campaign. The United States entered the war after Germany began attacking all commercial shipping bound for Britain, which inevitably meant American vessels went down too. On April 6, 1917, America declared war on Germany, and with its vastly superior resources now behind the Allies, the German war effort faced an impossible situation. The armistice was finally signed on November 11, 1918, ending the fighting. The problem was that Germany's political and military leadership had never actually prepared the public for defeat. Propaganda kept insisting victory was still within reach, right up until officials suddenly conceded and sought peace in late October. For most Germans, the shock was immediate and brutal. And that shock only deepened once the armistice terms, and then the far harsher peace terms of 1919, became clear, provoking near-universal outrage across the country. The Treaty of Versailles laid out a long list of punishing conditions for Germany, including a clause forcing it to accept full responsibility for the war's damage and losses, known as Article 231, or the War Guilt Clause. The treaty also demanded major territorial losses and reparations payments to the Allies, while restricting Germany's military to no more than 100,000 men. To many Germans, this felt like a stab in the back. After all, they'd signed an armistice, not an unconditional surrender. Germany had to hand over its combat aircraft and was barred from building warships. Its army was capped at that 100,000-man limit, which, once you factor in cooks, clerks, and support staff, was really a much smaller fighting force than the number suggests. On top of that came the crushing financial reparations for wartime damage in northern France and Belgium, all resting on a war guilt clause the overwhelming majority of Germans flatly rejected. They didn't believe Germany alone had caused the war. Many blamed the diplomatic encirclement engineered by the Allied powers. They felt betrayed, tricked, treated as a conquered people despite believing they'd never truly lost. Promises made by figures like President Woodrow Wilson had, in their eyes, simply been abandoned. Their national honor felt trampled, and a huge segment of the population seethed with resentment toward the rest of the world. Hitler was devastated. Like countless other Germans, he needed some way to explain the sudden, humiliating collapse. But where many simply grieved, he and others went further, pinning the blame on socialists, Marxists, and Jews. People they accused of undermining Germany from within this stab-in-the-back myth took hold in right-wing circles almost immediately after the war, offering a convenient explanation for the sudden defeat that the left-wing, Republican, and Jewish elements of German society on the home front had betrayed the nation. Most ordinary Germans didn't actually buy into this. The independent Social Democrats, mainstream Social Democrats, and the Communist Party together represented roughly a third of the electorate in the early 1920s. Hardly a fringe. The idea of a Jewish conspiracy stabbing Germany in the back was at the time still confined largely to a lunatic fringe on the far right. The war had given the young Hitler a role that genuinely suited him, but the abrupt loss was more than he or the nation could stomach. Combined with the humiliation of Versailles, this drove Hitler and a dangerous slice of the far right to hunt for scapegoats, a search that would give birth to a new political party and draw together some of the most dangerous men Germany would ever produce. Germany's shock defeat left the country humiliated, and the Treaty of Versailles saddled it with the burden of rebuilding the very nations that had defeated it. Compounding all this, Germany had already gone through its own revolution in 1918, though it wasn't until 1919 that the Weimar Republic was formally established, born out of a national assembly convened in the town of Weimar. Reparations to the Allies became one of the key accelerants of the hyperinflation crisis, which actually traced back to 1916, when the German government began printing money to fund the war. As anyone might guess, printing endless money fuels inflation, and post-war governments made little real effort to control it, largely because they could pin the blame squarely on the peace treaties and the Allies. Things spiraled so badly by 1923 that the Allies, and the Americans in particular, stepped in with the Dawes Plan, later followed by the Young Plan, both aimed at restructuring Germany's reparations schedule, though both ultimately failed to fix the underlying problem. The Dawes Plan, devised by American banker Charles G. Dawes, essentially had the U.S. lending money to Germany so it could pay reparations to Britain, France, and others, who in turn used those funds to repay their own wartime loans to the United States. It was a shaky circular arrangement of borrowed money propping up borrowed money. Amid all this upheaval, Hitler wanted to stay in the one field that had brought him a sense of purpose: soldiering. After the war, he remained in the drastically shrunken German army. He genuinely liked military life and felt at home within its rigid structure and hierarchy, whatever embellishments he later added about his service record. He attended training courses at Camp Lechfeld, taught in part by some of the era's most respected academics, though what they were really peddling was a heavy dose of ethno-nationalism and patriotic propaganda dressed up as political education, a tool for combating Bolshevik influence. Hitler turned out to be not just an eager student but a natural at this kind of political messaging himself, and he was soon recruited to deliver these fiery lectures on his own, discovering there his real talent for public speaking. The army later sent him to keep an eye on a small far-right group called the German Workers' Party, founded in Munich in January 1919 by Anton Drexler, a leading figure in the occult-tinged Thule Society. The group met regularly to discuss nationalist ideas, its core beliefs steeped in racism and anti-Semitism. It was during this surveillance assignment that Hitler grew increasingly drawn into the party's politics. He began speaking at its gatherings and quickly proved to be a remarkably gifted orator, absorbing its radical anti-Semitic worldview. The idea that Germany's defeat had been engineered by some hidden Jewish conspiracy. People who knew him described his mind as something like a vacuum cleaner, hoovering up and absorbing everything he came across, including the racist pseudoscience of figures like Adolf Lanz, a self-styled interpreter of a badly distorted version of Darwinism. Out of this jumble of borrowed ideas, Hitler assembled what would become National Socialist ideology. Having proven himself as a speaker, Hitler took on a larger role within the party, eventually becoming its head of propaganda, not yet the leader, a position still held by Anton Drexler, but effectively its PR man, churning out striking, inflammatory posters and organizing mass gatherings that drew steadily growing crowds. In 1920, Hitler pushed to rename the group, hoping to widen its appeal, and it became the National Socialist German Workers' Party. A year later, following a heated internal dispute in which he threatened to quit entirely, Hitler was named party president. From there, he began assembling a loyal, intelligent, and utterly ruthless inner circle. Post-war Bavaria, and Germany as a whole, was in chaos: runaway inflation, unemployment, street violence, strikes, and militant action from the political left. Hitler was clearly searching for a political home, and it seems he'd finally found one. As his reputation as a speaker spread through the far right, he steadily gathered a circle of devoted followers, each bringing their own skills, ideas, and ambitions. His closest early ally was Rudolf Hess, born April 26, 1894, in Alexandria, Egypt. Like so many others, Hess was consumed by the question of how Germany could possibly have lost the war, and someone needed to be blamed for it. After drifting into university life, he remained a frustrated radical nationalist until he met Hitler and was completely captivated. Hess embraced this vision of international struggle between races, becoming a fanatical admirer of Hitler, something plainly visible in the footage from the Nuremberg rallies, his face practically glowing with naive devotion. The most decorated of Hitler's men was Hermann Göring, born January 12, 1893, in Rosenheim, Bavaria. Göring was an unlikely recruit for the fledgling Nazi movement. By the 1920s, he cut a dashing figure with a genuine military reputation, having been a celebrated fighter pilot in the war and even taking command of the legendary Red Baron Squadron after Manfred von Richthofen's death. He carried himself as a glamorous, jovial ex-fighter ace, an image the German public adored. He wasn't naturally drawn to fringe radical politics, but Hitler seemed to voice his own bitterness and sense of loss, and Göring became a committed follower from that point forward. One of the movement's more sinister figures was Heinrich Himmler, born October 7, 1900, in Munich. Into a middle-class Catholic family, his father had once tutored the Bavarian royal family. Himmler carried a rather stiff, schoolmasterly air about him, and much of his personal frustration seems to have stemmed from being too young to fight in the First World War, a resentment that never really left him. He came across as an eccentric patriot with dreamy, scholarly mannerisms. But underneath that surface, as history would later reveal, lay a committed anti-Semite who found in National Socialism what felt to him like a natural home. Martin Bormann became one of Hitler's most trusted lieutenants, born June 17, 1900, the son of a postal worker. Bormann was, above all, a cold and calculating manipulator. He joined one of the Freikorps paramilitary groups that sprang up across Germany in the early 1920s and was actually imprisoned for his role in a murder. After his release, he too gravitated toward Hitler, convinced that this man articulated the shared grief and resentment so many Germans felt after 1918, and became a devoted follower. Finally, arguably the sharpest mind among them was Joseph Goebbels, born October 29, 1897, from the Rhine Valley. Goebbels stood out as something of an intellectual within the movement, university-educated, holding a doctorate, having studied 19th-century German literature. He was also a committed romantic nationalist who, before he'd even met Hitler, wrote a novel called Michael that essentially described a Hitler-like figure. The vision of a unified Germany, where all Germans stood as equals, appealed to him deeply, and he was actively searching for a political movement that matched his own worldview. He became an invaluable recruit, bringing with him an extraordinary and ruthlessly effective talent for organizing propaganda. These men were bound together by a shared sense of loss, humiliation, frustration, and rage over Germany's defeat. Feelings that, while common across the country, weren't unique to them. What set them apart was something else. Each described a kind of personal revelation upon hearing Hitler speak. He came across as an outsider, almost as though he'd been sent to restore Germany to its former glory, and settled the score with the Allies, fulfilling a mythic role embedded deep in German history and culture, echoing figures like Kaiser Frederick Barbarossa, the legendary king with the red beard destined to save Germany from her enemies. And now, in Hitler's mind, those enemies were closing in fast. Everything pointed toward a rising National Socialist movement. Hitler had built himself a loyal following, with some rallies drawing thousands. But it was events unfolding in Italy that truly lit a fire under his ambitions. Events that would carry enormous consequences for Hitler, his party, and the entire German nation. By this point, Hitler had surrounded himself with some of the most capable and dangerous men on the far right, and his rallies sometimes drew crowds of around 2,000. Still, his own sense of his importance, and his party's, was wildly inflated. In truth, he was still something like a man in a shabby raincoat standing on a soapbox in a town square, addressing a handful of onlookers on street corners. An old-fashioned form of grassroots politics. There were far more powerful, far more prominent right-wing parties in Germany at the time. What Hitler had, really, was just a loose gathering of people who shared roughly similar views. Then, Italy changed everything. In October 1922, the brash, square-jawed newspaper editor turned fascist leader, Benito Mussolini, led his black-shirted followers on a march to Rome. King Victor Emmanuel III was ultimately forced to hand control of the country over to Mussolini. Or at least, that's how Hitler chose to see it, and he immediately began plotting his own version of the same move. Hitler was deeply influenced by Mussolini's apparent coup, and from it, he conceived the idea of a march on Berlin. He began to believe wrongly that the German state in 1923 was so weakened by hyperinflation and crisis that it was ripe for the taking. He exploited the chaos of German politics that year, worsened by hyperinflation and the French occupation of the Ruhr, to force reparations payments, to attempt a coup in Munich. In reality, Mussolini had also mastered the art of propaganda and carefully controlled how the rest of Europe perceived him. Hitler, in effect, fell for Mussolini's own spin. The Italian king had actually appointed Mussolini head of government through a fully constitutional process. It wasn't a coup at all, just a rather weak-willed monarch, making a legitimate if questionable decision. Hitler's own gamble would prove far messier. On November 8, 1923, Hitler and roughly 600 stormtroopers surrounded the Bürgerbräukeller, a large beer hall in Munich, where Bavaria State Commissioner Gustav von Kahr was addressing a crowd of about 3,000 people. Hitler burst in, fired a pistol shot into the ceiling, and declared that revolution had begun. No one was to leave. Overnight, he tried and failed to seize power. By the early hours of November 9th, his group decided to march toward the Bavarian Ministry of Defense, but were intercepted by the Bavarian police along the way. Hitler had gambled that the newly reformed German army, the Reichswehr, would rally to his side. It didn't. The industrial establishment refused to back him, and the civil service treated the whole affair with contempt. When police opened fire, most of Hitler's followers scattered. A few were wounded, some killed. But the episode would later be transformed into an almost sacred moment in Nazi mythology. Hitler was arrested and put on trial, a proceeding that began on February 26, 1924, and wrapped up on April 1st. Fellow conspirators, including Rudolf Hess, were arrested and tried alongside him. On the surface, the whole putsch looked like a total failure for Hitler and his party. But what it gave the Nazis, remarkably, was a set of martyrs, a myth, a legend, an entirely new symbolic framework. Take the blood flag, the banner carried that day and stained during the violence. It became a sacred relic of the movement, later used at Nuremberg rallies to consecrate the standards of the stormtroopers by touching them to it. The fallen were later reburied in grand marble tombs in central Munich once the Nazis took power, and every year afterward. They staged an elaborate reenactment of the putsch, complete with torchlit night marches, radio broadcasts, and dramatic newsreel footage. A spectacle with an almost religious quality to it. The swastika itself, which Hitler claimed to have designed personally, was actually drawn from an ancient symbol tied to early Aryan mythology. In truth, an ancient Buddhist and Hindu symbol found throughout India and China, originally representing the sun. German nationalist circles had begun adopting it in the late 19th century as a symbol of Aryan identity. What Hitler actually contributed was a redesign that turned it into the unmistakable Nazi emblem. According to his own account, various designs were submitted to him, none of which satisfied him, so he set out to design it himself. The result was, whether one likes to admit it or not, a genuinely striking piece of graphic design. He tilted the symbol to create a sense of motion, carefully calculated the proportions of its bars, placed it inside a circle that didn't quite touch the edges, giving it a subtle visual vibration, and surrounded it with a bold red field, all built on the old imperial colors of red, black, and white, deliberately contrasting with the red-gold-black of the Republic's own flag. By the late 1920s, it had become the party's official emblem, simply because Hitler decreed that it would be at his trial. Hitler took full responsibility for the putsch, and it said the judges, clearly sympathetic to his cause, struggled to justify convicting him at all. In the end, he received a 5-year prison sentence, and was also banned from public speaking, a telling sign of just how central his oratory had become to the party's rise. Locked away and silenced, Hitler turned to writing instead. It was during this period of forced reflection that he seems to have undergone a personal transformation. Before the putsch, he hadn't seen himself as some chosen figure or messiah. It was only in Landsberg prison that the realization apparently crystallized. My God, I am him. And from that point on, he seemed to feel liberated to become the figure history remembers. He served less than a year of his sentence, alongside Rudolf Hess and others, using the time to write Mein Kampf. It's striking that Hitler chose to use his imprisonment in 1924 to sit down and document his own journey, how he'd arrived at his beliefs, what had shaped him. Clearly a meaningful act of self-reflection for him. His original, unwieldy title for the manuscript was something like 4.5 years of struggle against lies, stupidity, and cowardice. As publishers, sensibly, suggested something catchier, and the title was trimmed down to simply My Struggle, Mein Kampf. The book's most genuinely significant section is its famous 5th chapter, A Detailed Theory of Propaganda. The rest amounts largely to a rambling, emotionally charged collection of grievances rather than any coherent political blueprint. Nothing like Marx's Communist Manifesto or Das Kapital. Still, the publisher moved roughly 300,000 copies, and many more after Hitler rose to power, for reasons that are fairly obvious in hindsight. The original edition was a hefty volume, running to around 600 pages. Writing Mein Kampf only sharpened Hitler's hunger for power, but with his ban on public speaking still in effect, his path back to prominence would have to wait. That silence turned out to be one of the reasons the party struggled to regain momentum for a while. Hitler had become such a recognized and effective speaker that being the only person in Germany legally barred from speaking became, ironically, useful propaganda in itself, a way to attack the Weimar government for censorship. In 1927, the ban was eased, and it was later lifted entirely. Once Hitler was back on stage, something about his presence, not unlike a modern-day celebrity or pop star, drew people in, and many observers describe audiences as almost hypnotized by him. As soon as he could speak freely again, the party began its climb toward the successful parliamentary results of the late 1920s. Watching footage of Hitler on stage, it's less like witnessing brilliant oratory, and more like watching a kind of political theater. During Hitler's enforced silence, Germany had actually experienced a genuine recovery. Fueled largely by American investment, unemployment fell, the economy strengthened, and a wave of cautious optimism swept the country. By 1928, thanks to heavy American investment, Germany looked to be thriving, and the National Socialists might well have been reduced to a historical footnote, a fringe party with an eccentric leader and a failed putsch behind them. But fate had other plans. That genuine post-war recovery under the Weimar Republic collapsed almost overnight following the Wall Street crash in New York. As the saying of the time went, New York sneezed, London caught a cold, and Germany nearly died of influenza. The fallout from that crash would ultimately hand the National Socialists their path to absolute power. The unfolding Great Depression was the critical turning point. 7 million Germans found themselves out of work, with no relief in sight. And once a desperate worker walked through that door looking for hope, he became a potential recruit, a potential Nazi, a potential stormtrooper. What further measures would the Nazis impose to tighten their grip on power, and what horrors would be unleashed before this regime's eventual, dramatic collapse?